On a golden summer afternoon in 1995, two small figures pedaled away from home on a routine bike ride that would change everything. Katie and Evan Reynolds, aged 10 and 8, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a town frozen in grief. Their bikes were found abandoned near the woods, but no amount of searching could bring them back. The case went cold, buried under layers of speculation, guilt, and secrets too painful to confront. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. If you believe the truth always comes out, like and subscribe. Now, enjoy the story. Maple Hollow was a snapshot of suburban perfection in 1995. Manicured lawns stretched endlessly under wide blue skies. Children laughed as they raced their bikes down cul-de-sacs, and neighbors exchanged warm smiles over coffee cups or garden hedges. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, at least on the surface, and life felt safe enough to leave your front door unlocked. The Reynolds family fit seamlessly into this picturesque tableau. Margaret Reynolds, a soft-spoken woman with an artist's eye for detail, spent her days painting watercolors of hydrangeas and sunsets while keeping an ear out for her two children. Her husband James worked as a mechanic at the auto shop downtown, his hands calloused but gentle when he tucked his kids into bed at night. Their children were the heart of their small world. Katie, 10 years old and fiercely protective of her younger brother, had a knack for storytelling. She filled notebooks with tales of brave knights and enchanted forests, often reading them aloud to 8-year-old Evan, who hung on her every word. Evan, with his mop of unruly brown hair and a perpetual grin, loved nothing more than racing his bike through the neighborhood streets pretending he was flying like Superman. Life wasn't perfect. Margaret sometimes worried about money, and James came home tired from long shifts. But there was a quiet contentment that wrapped itself around the Reynolds household. They were just another happy family in Maple Hollow, indistinguishable from the rest. At least that's how it seemed. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring, one of those golden days when the air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming lilacs. After lunch, Katie convinced Evan to join her for a bike ride. "We'll be back before dinner," she promised Margaret, who waved them off from the porch, already distracted by a new canvas waiting inside. Katie led the way, weaving effortlessly between lampposts and mailboxes, while Evan pedaled furiously to keep up. They passed Mrs. Hargrove watering her roses, Mr. Patel trimming his hedges, and Tommy Wilkins chasing his dog across the street. Everyone waved hello. Everything felt normal, but something shifted near the edge of the local woods, a sprawling patch of trees that bordered the neighborhood. The woods weren't forbidden exactly, but parents warned their kids not to venture too far inside. Katie stopped suddenly, pointing toward a narrow dirt path that snaked into the shadows. "Let's see if we can find the old treehouse," she said, her voice tinged with mischief. Evan hesitated. He'd heard stories about strange noises coming from the woods, but Katie's confidence won him over. Hours later, panic swept through Maple Hollow when Margaret realized her children hadn't returned. Neighbors organized search parties, combing every street, backyard, and corner of the woods. Flashlights pierced the growing darkness as cries of "Katie! Evan!" echoed through the night. By morning, all they found were the siblings' bikes, lying abandoned at the edge of the woods. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just silence. In the weeks that followed, Maple Hollow transformed. The once vibrant neighborhood grew quieter, its inhabitants weighed down by grief and unanswered questions. Flyers with smiling photos of Katie and Evan plastered telephone poles, fading slowly in the sun and rain. Tips poured in, but none led anywhere. Detectives combed through leads, questioned neighbors, and even dredged the nearby creek, but the case went cold. For the Reynolds family, the loss shattered everything. Margaret retreated into herself, spending hours staring out windows or flipping through photo albums until tears blurred the images. James threw himself into work, only to come home each night and drown his sorrow in whiskey. Their marriage frayed under the weight of blame and unspoken guilt. Had they been too trusting, too distracted? As months turned into years, the disappearance became part of Maple Hollow's fabric, whispered about in grocery aisles and church pews. Some speculated the siblings had wandered deeper into the woods and gotten lost. Others hinted at darker possibilities, though no one dared say them aloud. Whatever the truth, it remained buried, along with the hopes of ever seeing Katie and Evan again. And so, Maple Hollow carried on, its idyllic facade cracked but intact. Yet beneath the surface, memories lingered like ghosts, haunting those who refused, or couldn't afford, to forget. 20 years had passed since the disappearance of Katie and Evan Reynolds, but Maple Hollow still carried the weight of that summer like an unspoken scar. For Caroline Marks, returning to her childhood home after decades away felt both familiar and unsettling. The house, a modest two-story with peeling blue shutters, had belonged to her parents until their passing, and now it fell to her to clean it out and prepare it for sale. At 58, Caroline was a woman shaped by time and experience. Her career as a school teacher had given her a deep well of patience and empathy, though she often joked that teaching fourth graders had aged her prematurely. Now retired, she found herself reflecting more on the past, the choices she'd made, the lives she'd touched, and the mysteries left unresolved. Caroline remembered the day Katie and Evan vanished as if it were yesterday. She had been in her mid-30s then, newly married and living just 2 doors down from the Reynolds family. She recalled Margaret's quiet strength crumbling into despair, James's stoic silence giving way to angry outbursts at the local bar. And she remembered the way the neighborhood changed overnight. The once bustling streets grew eerily quiet. Playgrounds sat empty, and trust among neighbors eroded like sandcastles under the tide. As she unpacked boxes in the attic of her parents' home, Carolyn couldn't help but wonder how much or how little Maple Hollow had healed. The houses looked the same, though many sported new coats of paint or updated roofs. Some neighbors remained older now, slower in their movements. Others had moved on, replaced by younger families who likely knew nothing of the tragedy that once defined this place. One afternoon, while sorting through her father's old workshop in the backyard, Caroline stumbled upon something unexpected. Buried beneath a pile of rusted tools and forgotten odds and ends were 2 objects that stopped her cold. A pair of bicycle helmets, one pink, one blue. They were dusty and faded, but unmistakably the same ones Katie and Evan had worn the day they disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat. How had these ended up here? Had someone hidden them deliberately? Or had they simply been misplaced all these years? Whatever the answer, their presence felt heavy with meaning, a tangible connection to a mystery that had haunted Maple Hollow for decades. Caroline sat back on her heels, staring at the helmets as memories flooded back. She thought about the endless searches, the whispered theories, the way the case had faded into legend over time. But most of all, she thought about Katie and Evan, the bright-eyed children who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions. For the first time in years, Caroline felt a spark of determination ignite within her. Maybe it was because she was older now, with fewer distractions and more perspective. Maybe it was because selling her parents' house forced her to confront the ghosts of her own past. Whatever the reason, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let this discovery go unnoticed. Not again. The crawl space beneath the old shed was dark and musty, a forgotten corner of the property that had likely gone untouched for decades. Caroline had only ventured into it because she'd noticed the warped wooden door slightly ajar, a detail that seemed out of place in an otherwise meticulously maintained yard. Her father had always been particular about his tools and storage spaces, so this mysterious neglect intrigued her. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of curiosity, she crouched low to peer inside. The beam of light revealed a jumble of forgotten items, rusted cans of paint, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and a tarp draped haphazardly over something bulky. As she pulled the tarp aside, her breath hitched. Beneath it lay 2 small bicycle helmets, one pink, one blue, resting side by side as though carefully placed there long ago. Caroline's heart pounded as she reached for them, brushing away layers of dust. Despite their age, the colors remained vivid, evoking memories of Katie and Evan riding their bikes through the neighborhood streets. But what truly sent a chill down her spine was what she found tucked inside the helmet liner of the pink one. Nestled within was a crumpled photograph of the Reynolds siblings, smiling brightly against the backdrop of a summer afternoon. On the back, written in childish scrawl, were the words, "Katie and Evan, best friends forever." Beneath the photo was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Carefully unfolding it, Caroline discovered a crude drawing of Maple Hollow's street layout, complete with stick figure houses and labeled names of families who had lived there in 1995. At the edge of the map near the woods, someone had drawn a large red X. Her hands trembled as she studied the markings. Was this some kind of clue? A desperate attempt by the children to leave a trail? Or something more sinister, a message meant to point fingers at whoever had taken them? Caroline sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Whoever had hidden these helmets and the items inside had gone to great lengths to ensure they wouldn't be found. Why here in her parents' shed? Had her father known about them? If so, why hadn't he said anything? She glanced around the dimly lit crawl space, suddenly feeling as though unseen eyes were watching her. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an invitation, or perhaps a warning, to dig deeper. And Caroline, despite the unease settling in her chest, knew she couldn't turn away now. Caroline hesitated for only a moment before deciding to report her discovery to the police. She knew it was the right thing to do, but the weight of what she was about to unleash felt almost unbearable. The helmets and the cryptic drawing inside were more than just relics of the past. They were keys to reopening wounds that Maple Hollow had tried desperately to heal over. When news broke that evidence linked to the Reynolds siblings' disappearance had been found, the quiet suburb erupted once again. Local reporters descended on Maple Hollow like storm clouds, setting up cameras outside the Reynolds home and interviewing anyone willing to speak. Headlines blared, "Breakthrough in Maple Hollow Mystery," and new clues spark hope for closure after 30 years. Margaret and James Reynolds, now in their late 70s, were thrust back into the spotlight they'd spent decades trying to escape. Margaret, frail but composed, appeared briefly at a press conference held by the police department. Her voice quivered as she pleaded for answers. "If there's even the smallest chance we can find out what happened to Katie and Evan, please help us bring them home." James, who walked with a cane and rarely left his house anymore, stayed silent throughout the ordeal. His eyes betrayed a mix of hope and resignation, as though he'd long since given up believing the truth would ever come to light. Detective Sarah Monroe, a seasoned investigator assigned to the reopened case, brought fresh energy and modern tools to the investigation. DNA analysis, which hadn't been available in 1995, was now a cornerstone of forensic work. The helmets were carefully dusted for fingerprints, swabbed for skin cells, and examined for any trace evidence that might point to where or who they'd come from. Old witness statements were revisited, some of which had been dismissed or overlooked in the chaos of the original search. Neighbors who remembered bits and pieces of that fateful day were interviewed again, their memories jogged by photographs and maps. One neighbor recalled seeing a man walking near the woods around the time Katie and Evan vanished, a detail that had slipped through the cracks all those years ago. Another mentioned hearing strange noises coming from the woods that evening, though no one had thought much of it at the time. Detective Monroe also reached out to Caroline, recognizing her unique position as both a longtime resident and someone intimately connected to the new evidence. "You've lived here longer than most," and she said during one meeting. "Do you think your parents could have known something? Or maybe someone confided in them?" Caroline shook her head slowly, though doubt lingered in her mind. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm going to find out." While the official investigation gained momentum, Caroline embarked on her own parallel quest for answers, driven by a gnawing sense of guilt that she might have missed something crucial back in 1995. She began combing through old boxes in her parents' attic, searching for anything that might shed light on the mystery. She unearthed photo albums filled with snapshots of neighborhood gatherings, birthday parties, and summer barbecues. Among them, she found pictures of Katie and Evan playing in the cul-de-sac, their smiles frozen in time. There were also letters and notes exchanged between her parents and other neighbors, some of which hinted at tensions simmering beneath Maple Hollow's polished surface. One letter stood out. Dated just weeks before the disappearance, it was addressed to her father from a neighbor named Mrs. Hargrove. In neat cursive, Mrs. Hargrove wrote, "I saw him again last night, lurking near the woods. He gives me the creeps. You should talk to him." No name followed, but Caroline immediately suspected the reference was to Harold Grayson, a reclusive handyman who'd lived on the edge of the neighborhood. Harold had died years earlier under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind rumors of erratic behavior and unexplained absences. Determined to piece together the puzzle, Caroline started visiting elderly neighbors, gently prodding them for forgotten details. Some were reluctant to talk, fearful of stirring up old ghosts. Others welcomed her questions, eager to share fragments of memories they'd kept buried for decades. Each conversation added another layer to the story, painting a picture of a community fractured not just by grief, but by secrets too painful to confront. As she dug deeper, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the red X on the map, the one drawn so deliberately by young hands, was pointing her toward the truth. But the closer she got, the more uneasy she became. Someone in Maple Hollow didn't want these secrets uncovered, and whoever it was might still be watching. As Caroline delved deeper into the past, she realized that Maple Hollow wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a labyrinth of secrets, each one tangled with the next. The longer she spoke to her neighbors, the more apparent it became that everyone had their own version of what happened in 1995. Some stories aligned, others contradicted each other entirely. But beneath the surface of polite smiles and faded memories lay a web of guilt, fear, and unspoken truths. Caroline's first stop was Mrs. Hargrove, now in her late 80s and living in an assisted care facility on the outskirts of town. Though frail, her memory remained sharp, especially when it came to the people who had once lived near the woods. "Harold Grayson," Mrs. Hargrove said firmly, leaning forward in her chair. "That man was trouble from the start, always skulking around, making excuses to borrow tools or check fences. I told your father about him, warned him not to trust him. But did anyone listen?" No. She paused, her gaze distant as if recalling something painful. I saw Harold near the woods that day. He said he was looking for his dog, but I didn't believe him. There was something off about him. After the kids disappeared, he acted stranger than ever. Wouldn't meet my eyes, avoided talking to anyone. And then he up and left town a few months later. Caroline scribbled notes furiously, her pulse quickening. Harold had been dead for over a decade, but his name kept coming up. What role had he played in the tragedy? Was he involved, or merely another victim of baseless suspicion? Next, Caroline visited Mr. Patel, the retired owner of the corner store, who still lived in the same house where he'd raised his family. His shop had been a hub of activity in the 90s, and he remembered seeing Katie and Evan nearly every day as they stopped by for candy or soda. They were good kids, Mr. Patel said wistfully, his voice tinged with sadness. But there was tension in the air back then. People don't want to admit it now, but the neighborhood wasn't as perfect as everyone liked to think. When pressed, he revealed a startling detail. James Reynolds, Katie and Evan's father, had gotten into a heated argument with Harold Grayson just days before the disappearance. I heard them shouting outside my store, Mr. Patel recalled. James accused Harold of spying on his kids, said he'd seen him lurking near their house. Harold denied it, of course, but you could tell he was rattled. Caroline frowned. If James had suspected Harold of wrongdoing, why hadn't that information come out during the original investigation? Had he withheld it out of shame, or because he feared implicating himself? Tommy Wilkins, now a middle-aged man running a landscaping business, had been one of Katie and Evan's closest friends. When Caroline tracked him down, he hesitated before agreeing to talk. It was clear the memories still haunted him. We used to dare each other to go into the woods, Tommy admitted, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. Katie loved adventure, always wanting to explore. But Evan hated it. He was scared of the dark. One time we found this old well deep in the trees. Katie thought it was cool, but Evan freaked out and begged us to leave. We never went back there again. The mention of the well sent a chill through Caroline. Could it be connected to the red X on the map? She asked Tommy if he'd seen anything unusual the day of the disappearance, but he shook his head. All I remember is hearing someone shout in the distance while I was playing with my dog. By the time I got home, everyone was already looking for them. Unable to ignore the elephant in the room, Caroline finally worked up the courage to visit Margaret Reynolds. Sitting across from the elderly woman in her dimly lit living room, Caroline felt a lump rise in her throat. Margaret looked so small, so fragile, yet her eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of decades of unresolved pain. I should have stopped them, Margaret whispered, clutching a photo of her children. Evan wanted to stay home, but Katie insisted they ride their bikes. I let her take him. I trusted this place, trusted our neighbors. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Caroline left the house feeling both closer to the truth and farther away than ever. Everyone had suspicions, but no one had proof. And without proof, the mystery remained unsolved. Back at her parents' house, Caroline spread out her notes on the dining table, piecing together fragments of testimony like a jigsaw puzzle. Harold Grayson loomed large in the narrative, but there were inconsistencies. Some claimed he was harmless, a misunderstood loner. Others painted him as a predator hiding in plain sight. Then there was the argument between James and Harold, the sighting near the woods, and the mysterious well marked by the red X. One thing was certain. The idyllic facade of Maple Hollow had cracked wide open, revealing fractures that had existed long before Katie and Evan vanished. As Caroline stared at the map with its ominous marking, she knew the answers lay somewhere in those woods, and that finding them would require confronting the darkest corners of the past. As Caroline sifted through the tangled threads of Maple Hollow's past, one name kept surfacing alongside Harold Grayson: Hank Dillard. Unlike Grayson, who had left town shortly after the disappearance, Hank had remained in the neighborhood until his death 5 years ago. A reclusive handyman, an occasional gardener, he'd lived alone in a small house directly across the street from the Reynolds family, a proximity that now seemed chillingly significant. Neighbors described Hank as odd or quiet, though no one could quite articulate why they felt uneasy around him. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, avoided social gatherings, and spent most of his time tinkering in his garage or wandering the woods behind his property. Back in 1995, suspicions about him were whispered but never pursued. After all, Hank had been a familiar face in the community for decades. How could someone so ordinary be capable of something monstrous? But Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that Hank's presence in the narrative was more than mere coincidence. Determined to uncover the truth, she began digging into his life, piecing together fragments of memory and evidence that pointed toward a darker reality. Caroline started with Mrs. Wilkins, Tommy's mother, who had lived next door to Hank for over 30 years. Now widowed and living with her son, she welcomed Caroline into her home with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Hank was peculiar, Mrs. Wilkins said carefully, choosing her words with obvious discomfort. He kept to himself, which wasn't unusual, but there was something off about him. I remember hearing loud noises coming from his house late at night, like banging or shouting, and sometimes I'd catch him staring out his window at the Reynolds house. It gave me the creeps. She paused, glancing at Caroline, as if weighing whether to share more. Finally, she added, "After the kids disappeared, I thought about saying something to the police, but then I convinced myself it was nothing. Just an old man being nosy. Besides, everyone liked Hank. He fixed things for people, mowed lawns when folks were sick. Who would believe me?" Her voice trailed off, heavy with regret. Caroline nodded sympathetically, making a mental note to investigate further. If Hank had indeed been watching the Reynolds family, what had he seen or done? Encouraged by Mrs. Wilkins' revelation, Caroline decided to visit Hank's old house. Though it had been sold several times since his death, the current owner, a young couple who worked long hours in the city, rarely stayed there. With permission, Caroline gained access to the property, hoping to find clues hidden within its walls. The interior was dusty and neglected, filled with the remnants of previous owners. As she explored the cramped rooms, her attention was drawn to the basement, a space Hank had reportedly used as his workshop. The air smelled musty, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling beams. In one corner stood an old workbench, cluttered with rusted tools, while shelves sagged under the weight of jars containing screws, nails, and other hardware. But it was a section of the far wall that caught Caroline's eye. The paint looked fresher there, as though it had been touched up recently, or perhaps covered something. Using a flashlight, she examined the surface closely and noticed faint outlines of a seam. Pushing gently, she discovered a hidden panel that swung open to reveal a narrow alcove. Inside, she found a collection of items that made her blood run cold. Photographs of the Reynolds children, taken without their knowledge. Newspaper clippings about their disappearance, and a journal filled with cryptic entries detailing daily observations of the family. One passage read, "Katie is fearless, always leading Evan. She trusts too easily. Today they rode their bikes toward the woods again. I followed them part way, staying out of sight. They didn't see me." Caroline's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The entries grew increasingly obsessive, detailing Hank's fixation on the siblings and his growing resentment of James Reynolds, whom he referred to as overbearing and controlling. There were also mentions of arguments between Hank and Harold Grayson, suggesting a rivalry neither man had acknowledged publicly. Among the items in the hidden alcove was another map, similar to the one Caroline had found in the helmet. This one featured detailed notes about paths through the woods, including sketches of landmarks like the old well. At the center of the map was a large red circle surrounding what appeared to be a shallow depression near the edge of the forest. Realizing this might be the breakthrough she needed, Caroline contacted Detective Monroe, sharing her findings. Together, they organized a search team to investigate the area marked on the map. As they ventured into the woods, Caroline couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The trees loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. When they reached the depression, the ground showed signs of recent disturbance. Soil samples were collected, and excavation efforts began. Within hours, the unthinkable was confirmed. Buried beneath layers of earth were remnants of clothing, along with two small bicycles partially encased in mud. The discovery sent shockwaves through Maple Hollow. Forensic analysis confirmed the items belonged to Katie and Evan Reynolds. While definitive proof of Hank's involvement wouldn't come until DNA evidence linked him to the scene, The circumstantial case against him was overwhelming. Neighbors expressed disbelief, guilt, and anger. How had they failed to see the danger lurking so close to home? For Caroline, the revelation brought a mix of relief and sorrow. She had uncovered the truth, but it came at a cost. The idyllic childhood memories of Maple Hollow were forever tainted, replaced by the harsh reality of human frailty and betrayal. Yet amidst the grief, there was a glimmer of closure. Margaret and James Reynolds finally had answers, however painful, and the community began the slow process of healing. For Caroline, the experience served as a reminder that even the quietest places hold secrets, and that persistence, no matter how daunting, can bring light to the darkest corners. As Caroline continued her investigation into Hank Dillard's life, she returned to her parents' attic, determined to unearth anything else that might shed light on his involvement in the Reynolds siblings' disappearance. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten relics, dusty photo albums, boxes of holiday decorations, and stacks of papers tied with brittle string. It was during one of these deep dives that she stumbled upon something unexpected. A weathered ledger from the Maple Hollow Neighborhood Watch Program. The ledger had been tucked away in a cardboard box labeled Community Records, its cover faded but still legible. Inside were meticulous entries documenting volunteer schedules, patrol routes, and notes about suspicious activity reported by residents. Flipping through the pages, Caroline froze when she reached the entry for July 15, 1995, the day Katie and Evan vanished. There it was, written in neat cursive, volunteer assigned to monitor East Cul-de-sac, Reynolds residence, Hank Dillard. Beneath his name was a brief note, "We'll keep an eye on children biking in the area. Reported no issues as of noon." Her stomach churned as she read the words over and over again. Hank hadn't just been a passive observer. He'd actively volunteered to watch over the very kids who later disappeared. This wasn't mere coincidence. It was premeditation. Had he used his position within the neighborhood watch to gain access to information about the Reynolds family? To plan his movements without raising suspicion? Caroline's mind raced back to the journal she'd found in Hank's hidden alcove. His obsessive notes about Katie and Evan's routines suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. He hadn't been merely watching them, he'd been stalking them, waiting for the perfect opportunity to act. Further examination of the ledger revealed additional disturbing details. Hank had volunteered for neighborhood watch duties more frequently than any other resident, often requesting shifts near the woods or areas where children played. Notes alongside his name hinted at vague concerns he'd raised, claims of hearing strange noises or spotting unfamiliar vehicles, but none had ever been substantiated. One particularly chilling entry stood out. Hank reports seeing unknown man lurking near woods, claims individual matches, description of recent loitering complaint. No further action taken due to lack of evidence. The date of this report was just 2 weeks before the disappearance. Was Hank trying to deflect attention onto someone else? Or had he fabricated the sighting entirely to create plausible deniability for himself? Caroline couldn't help but wonder how many red flags had been ignored because Hank was seen as harmless, a quiet man who simply wanted to contribute to the community. In hindsight, his eagerness to participate in the neighborhood watch seemed less like altruism and more like a calculated effort to place himself above suspicion. Armed with the ledger, Caroline revisited Mrs. Wilkins, hoping to fill in gaps in her understanding of Hank's behavior. When shown the document, Mrs. Wilkins sighed deeply, her expression heavy with regret. "I remember him volunteering all the time," she admitted. "He always said he liked helping people feel safe. We thought it was sweet, especially since he didn't have a family of his own. But now, she trailed off, shaking her head. Now I see how clever he was. He made sure everyone trusted him while he did. Whatever it is he did. Mrs. Wilkins then shared another troubling detail. Shortly after the disappearance, Hank had approached her, claiming he'd seen Katie and Evan heading toward the woods earlier that afternoon. He acted so concerned, asking if anyone had searched there yet. At the time, I thought he was just being helpful. But looking back, maybe he was trying to steer the investigation away from himself. Back at her dining table, Caroline spread out her growing collection of evidence. The helmets, the map with the red X, Hank's journal, and now the damning ledger. Each piece fit together like fragments of a grim mosaic, painting a picture of a man who had exploited the trust of his neighbors to commit an unspeakable crime. It became clear that Hank had used his role in the neighborhood watch to track the Reynolds children's movements, positioning himself as their protector while secretly planning their abduction. The red X on the map likely marked the spot where he'd buried the bikes and possibly the children themselves, an attempt to erase all traces of his guilt. But why had he done it? What drove a seemingly ordinary man to such extremes? Caroline suspected the answer lay in the toxic combination of loneliness, obsession, and resentment hinted at in his journal entries. Hank had fixated on the Reynolds family, envying their closeness while simultaneously despising James for what he perceived as arrogance. In his twisted mind, taking Katie and Evan may have been both an act of revenge and a desperate bid for connection. With the ledger as corroborating evidence, Detective Monroe reopened discussions with Margaret and James Reynolds, explaining how Hank Dillard had manipulated his way into a position of trust before betraying that trust in the worst possible way. Though justice would never bring their children back, knowing the truth allowed them to begin the long process of healing. For Caroline, the discovery of the ledger served as a sobering reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Maple Hollow's idyllic facade had blinded its residents to the dangers lurking among them, allowing Hank to operate unchecked for decades. Yet in uncovering his secrets, Caroline also found redemption, not just for herself, but for a community yearning for closure. After the revelation of Hank Dillard's involvement in the Reynolds siblings' disappearance, Caroline felt a mix of determination and unease. She knew there was still more to uncover, more pieces of the puzzle that could explain why Hank had done what he did. Her instincts led her to the county archives, where many of Hank's personal belongings had been stored after his death. The items had gone largely untouched for years, deemed unimportant by those who assumed Hank was just another reclusive neighbor with no connection to the tragedy. When Caroline requested access to his estate records, she was handed a dusty cardboard box labeled Hank Dillard, Miscellaneous Personal Effects. Inside, she found a collection of tattered notebooks, loose papers, and faded photographs. Among these were several leather-bound journals, their spines cracked with age. As she opened the first journal, a wave of emotion hit her. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, filled with fragmented thoughts and cryptic musings that painted a portrait of a deeply troubled man. The entries revealed a mind consumed by paranoia, obsession, and inner turmoil. Hank wrote extensively about his struggles with loneliness and feelings of inadequacy, often referring to himself as broken or unworthy. There were frequent mentions of voices in his head, whispers urging him to act, though he rarely specified what actions they demanded. At times, his writing took on a poetic, almost biblical tone. The world burns with sin, but I have seen the flames flicker out. I will protect them from the fire, even if they do not understand, even if they cry out against me. Carolyn's heart sank as she read these lines. They suggested that Hank believed he was saving Katie and Evan, not harming them. His delusions had twisted his perception of reality, convincing him that removing the children from their lives was an act of salvation rather than destruction. One particularly chilling entry stood out. They are innocent, untainted by the corruption around them, but the fire spreads quickly, and soon it will reach them too. I must take them away before it's too late. Somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, a place where the flames cannot follow. Beneath this passage was a crude sketch of the woods near Maple Hollow, eerily similar to the map Caroline had discovered earlier. In the center of the drawing was a large X, placed exactly where the bikes, and later the remains, had been found. It was clear now, Hank had chosen the woods as his safe haven, a secluded spot where he thought he could shield the children from whatever horrors haunted his mind. Throughout the journals, Hank repeatedly referenced the fire, a metaphorical force he seemed to believe threatened everyone in the neighborhood, but especially the Reynolds family. He described James Reynolds as a man consumed by pride, someone whose arrogance would inevitably lead to ruin. Margaret, meanwhile, was portrayed as fragile and naive, incapable of protecting her children from the dangers lurking outside their home. Katie and Evan, however, were different. To Hank, they represented purity and hope, qualities he desperately wanted to preserve. But his methods were horrifyingly misguided. Instead of rescuing them from harm, he had condemned them to a fate worse than death, all in the name of keeping them safe. One entry provided insight into his warped logic. If I can save even one soul from the fire, then my suffering will mean something. Katie understands. She trusts me. Evan fights back, but he is young. He doesn't know what's coming. I will make sure that neither of them feels the heat. These words sent shivers down Caroline's spine. For all his talk of protection, Hank had only succeeded in destroying two innocent lives and fracturing an entire community in the process. As Caroline continued reading, she uncovered glimpses of Hank's own childhood, which appeared to be the root of his instability. Entries hinted at a strict, abusive father who punished him harshly for minor infractions, leaving scars far deeper than any physical wound. There were also references to a mother who disappeared when he was young, abandoning him to a life of neglect and isolation. She left because she couldn't bear to look at me anymore. I remind her of the fire. Everyone does. That's why I stay alone. Why I watch from afar. If no one sees me, maybe the fire won't find me either. It became painfully clear that Hank's actions weren't born purely of malice. They were the tragic result of untreated mental illness, compounded by decades of unresolved trauma. Yet understanding his motivations offered little comfort. The damage he had caused was irreversible, and the pain he inflicted would haunt Maple Hollow forever. With Hank's journals in hand, Caroline shared her findings with Detective Monroe, who agreed to incorporate them into the official investigation. While the evidence confirmed Hank's guilt beyond any doubt, it also highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Mental health stigma, combined with the blind trust placed in familiar faces, had created the perfect storm, a tragedy waiting to happen. For Margaret and James Reynolds, the journals provided both answers and anguish. Though they finally understood why their children had been taken, the knowledge brought no peace. Margaret clung to the idea that Katie and Evan might have been spared some measure of suffering in their final moments, while James wrestled with guilt over his role in the events leading up to their abduction. Caroline, too, grappled with conflicting emotions. She had sought justice for the Reynolds family, but the truth had come at a cost. Maple Hollow would never be the same again, not for her nor for anyone else touched by the case. Still, she took solace in knowing that persistence and courage had brought light to the shadows, ensuring that Hank's victims would not be forgotten. The discovery of Hank Dillard's journals and the map, with its ominous red X, had brought Caroline closer to the truth than ever before. But something still gnawed at her, a nagging sense that the woods held more secrets yet to be unearthed. She couldn't shake the image of the sketch in Hank's journal, particularly the way it seemed to depict not just a random spot in the forest, but a specific structure buried beneath layers of earth and time. Determined to follow every lead, Caroline reached out to Tommy Wilkins, Evan's childhood friend, who now worked as a local contractor. Tommy had grown into a sturdy, no-nonsense man in his late 30s, with a reputation for tackling tough jobs and solving complex problems. When Caroline explained what she'd found so far, the helmets, the journals, the maps, Tommy didn't hesitate to join her quest. "I've always wondered about those woods," he admitted over coffee one morning. "Evan used to talk about an old bunker or storm shelter back there, but we never went looking for it. Too scared, I guess." His voice softened as memories surfaced. "If there's even a chance this could bring some kind of closure, I'm in." Together, they gathered tools and supplies, preparing for a trek into the dense wilderness behind where the bikes had been discovered. Armed with shovels, flashlights, and a metal detector borrowed from Tommy's crew, they set off early one misty morning, the air thick with anticipation. The path through the woods was treacherous, choked with underbrush and fallen branches. As they ventured deeper, the sounds of civilization faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. Guided by the coordinates marked on the map and the sketches in Hank's journal, they eventually arrived at the location of the red X. At first glance, the area appeared unremarkable, a patch of uneven ground covered in moss and decaying leaves. But when Tommy swept the metal detector over the site, the device let out a sharp beep. Kneeling down, he began clearing away debris, revealing a section of cracked concrete partially hidden beneath years of overgrowth. "This has got to be it," Tommy said, his voice tight with emotion. They worked together, digging carefully until the outline of a small rectangular door emerged. It was the entrance to a storm shelter, or rather what remained of one. Decades of neglect had left it collapsed and unstable, vines wrapping around the edges like nature reclaiming its own. Caroline's heart pounded as she stared at the bunker. This was it, the place Hank had chosen as his safe haven. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but she pushed forward, knowing they were close to finding answers. Clearing the entrance proved challenging. The roof of the shelter had partially caved in, making it difficult to access the interior. Tommy used his expertise to shore up the structure temporarily, ensuring it wouldn't collapse further as they explored. Once stable enough, they pried open the rusted latch and descended into the darkness below. The air inside was damp and suffocating, carrying the faint smell of mildew and decay. Flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating walls lined with crumbling shelves and scattered remnants of supplies, old tin cans, blankets stiff with age, and a rusted lantern lying on the floor. In the center of the room stood a makeshift cot, its mattress disintegrating into dust. But it was the corner of the bunker that drew their attention. There, tucked beneath a pile of rotting fabric, was a wooden box. Its surface was scratched and splintered, but it appeared intact. With trembling hands, Caroline opened it, revealing its contents. A collection of personal items belonging to Katie and Evan, a hairbrush, a few toys, a tattered copy of one of Katie's Knight and Dragon stories, and a locket engraved with Evan's initials. Tears welled in Caroline's eyes as she realized the significance of these objects. Hank hadn't simply taken the children, he had kept pieces of them here, perhaps as mementos or talismans to fuel his delusions. For all his talk of protecting them, he had imprisoned them in this desolate place, cutting them off from everything they loved. Among the items in the box was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Carefully unfolding it, Caroline recognized Katie's handwriting. It was a note written in shaky letters. "Dear Mom and Dad, please come find us. We're scared. He says he's keeping us safe, but we don't understand why we can't go home. Love, Katie." And Caroline struggled to process this revelation. For 30 years, the people of Maple Hollow, including herself, had imagined every possible scenario: kidnappers, human traffickers, even supernatural explanations. But the reality was far more mundane and infinitely more tragic. Katie and Evan hadn't been taken by some shadowy figure lurking in the woods. They had been left to die in silence by a man who thought he was saving them. Inside the bunker, investigators found additional clues that hinted at the terror the siblings must have endured. Scratches on the wall suggested desperate attempts to escape, while faint traces of soil and debris indicated they had tried to dig their way out. A small pile of rocks near the collapsed roof showed where they might have worked together to weaken the structure, hoping to attract attention from above. Most haunting of all was the positioning of the remains. Katie's skeleton was found closer to the door, as if she had shielded her younger brother in their final moments. Evan's bones were crumpled nearby, curled into a fetal position, a posture of despair and resignation. It was clear they had clung to each other until the very end, their bond unbroken even in death. The absence of foul play raised difficult questions about Hank's state of mind during those final days. Had he intended to return for the children but lost his nerve? Or had guilt and fear driven him to abandon them altogether, choosing instead to bury the evidence and pretend nothing had happened? His journals offered some insight. One entry, written shortly after the disappearance, hinted at overwhelming remorse. "I did what I thought was right, but now the weight is crushing me. I hear their voices in my dreams, calling for help. I can't go back. If anyone finds out, I don't know what I'll do." It was likely that Hank's shame prevented him from admitting what he'd done, not only to others, but also to himself. By hiding the bunker and concealing the truth, he ensured that Katie and Evan's cries for help went unanswered. For decades. For Margaret and James Reynolds, the confirmation of their children's deaths brought a mix of relief and anguish. At last, they could say goodbye, laying Katie and Evan to rest in a proper ceremony attended by friends, family, and neighbors. Photographs of the smiling siblings adorned the church altar, surrounded by flowers and mementos from their childhood. Margaret spoke briefly during the service, her voice trembling but resolute. "We never stopped loving you," she said, addressing the empty caskets, "and we will carry you in our hearts forever." James, leaning heavily on his cane, remained silent throughout the proceedings. But as the sun set over Maple Hollow Cemetery, he placed a single rose atop each casket, his tears speaking volumes. The revelations sent shockwaves through the community, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their neighbors. How could they have failed to see the warning signs? Why had they dismissed Hank's odd behavior as harmless eccentricity rather than investigating further? In response, local leaders organized town hall meetings to discuss mental health awareness and community responsibility. Schools implemented programs aimed at teaching students how to recognize and report suspicious activity, ensuring that no child would ever slip through the cracks again. Though painful, these efforts helped transform grief into action, fostering a renewed sense of unity and vigilance. For Caroline, the experience left an indelible mark on her soul. She had started this journey seeking answers, but along the way, she discovered something far greater: the power of persistence and the importance of confronting the past, no matter how painful. Sitting alone in her parents' attic one evening, she penned a letter to Katie and Evan, promising to keep their memory alive. Maple Hollow would never forget its lost children or the lessons their tragedy had taught. And though scars remained, so too did hope. A quiet reminder that even in the darkest places, light could still find a way to shine through. The truth about Hank Dillard's role in Katie and Evan's disappearance forced Maple Hollow to confront not only its past, but also the systemic failures that had allowed such a tragedy to occur. What emerged was a sobering portrait of a community that had prioritized appearances over action, silence over intervention, and denial over accountability. As investigators delved deeper into Hank's history, they uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior that neighbors had long ignored, or worse, excused. Decades earlier, Hank's erratic actions had raised eyebrows, yet no one had taken the initiative to intervene. Neighbors recalled seeing him pacing late at night, muttering to himself, or lingering too long outside homes where children played. They noticed his obsession with the Reynolds family, his frequent offers to help, and his increasingly strange comments about protecting others from unseen threats. Yet instead of addressing these red flags, many residents chose to look the other way, dismissing Hank as merely eccentric or harmless. His reputation as a handyman who fixed broken fences and mowed lawns for free earned him goodwill, masking the underlying instability that should have been cause for concern. Even local authorities, when approached with vague complaints about Hank's behavior, had downplayed the reports, citing a lack of evidence or urgency. This collective negligence extended beyond Hank himself. Mental health issues were stigmatized in the 1990s, especially in small-town America, where discussions of psychological struggles were often met with discomfort or outright dismissal. If anyone suspected Hank was battling demons, they kept their suspicions private, unwilling to risk alienating him or drawing attention to something so taboo. Caroline reflected bitterly on this cultural blind spot during a conversation with Detective Monroe. "We didn't just fail Katie and Evan," she said quietly. "We failed Hank, too. If someone had reached out, if we treated mental illness like the serious issue it is, maybe none of this would have happened." Hank's journals provided further insight into the distorted lens through which he viewed the world. To him, the Reynolds family represented everything pure and good, a stark contrast to the corruption and decay he believed plagued society. In his mind, James Reynolds' stern demeanor and Margaret's quiet reserve weren't simply parental traits. They were signs of impending doom, proof that the fire was spreading. His fixation on Katie and Evan grew into an all-consuming mission to save them. He convinced himself that removing them from their home was the only way to shield them from harm, even if it meant imprisoning them in a dark, isolated bunker. The irony was cruel. In trying to protect the children, Hank had condemned them to a fate far worse than anything he imagined. One particularly haunting entry captured the depth of his delusion. "They will thank me someday. When the flames consume everything else, when the world crumbles under its own weight, they will remember that I saved them. Until then, I must endure their cries. Their fear is temporary. My purpose is eternal." Reading these words, Caroline felt a mixture of pity and revulsion. Hank wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a deeply broken man whose untreated mental illness had spiraled out of control. But that knowledge did little to soften the blow of what he had done. For Caroline, the most painful realization was how complicit the neighborhood had been in enabling Hank's descent. By turning a blind eye to his odd behavior, by refusing to acknowledge the warning signs, Maple Hollow had unwittingly facilitated the tragedy. Worse still, the community's preference for silence over confrontation had created an environment where secrets festered unchecked. She thought back to her own memories of Hank, the times she'd seen him wandering the streets late at night, the awkward conversations she'd avoided because he made her uncomfortable. Had she sensed something was wrong? Yes. Had she acted on it? Like everyone else, she had chosen convenience over courage, complacency over curiosity. At a town meeting held weeks after the discovery of the remains, Caroline stood before a somber crowd of neighbors, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "We can't change the past," she began, "but we owe it to Katie and Evan, and to ourselves to learn from it. For too long, we've let fear dictate our actions, letting problems simmer beneath the surface until they explode. That ends now." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of introspection among attendees. Some nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears, visibly shaken by the weight of their shared guilt. It was clear that Maple Hollow would never be the same again, but perhaps that was a good thing. In the months that followed, the community took steps to ensure such a tragedy could never happen again. A memorial garden was erected near the edge of the woods, honoring Katie and Evan and serving as a reminder of the cost of indifference. Local leaders partnered with mental health organizations to host workshops and support groups, encouraging open dialogue about struggles often kept hidden. For Caroline, the experience marked both an ending and a beginning. Though she planned to sell her parents' house and move on, she resolved to stay involved in efforts to make Maple Hollow a safer, more compassionate place. She found solace in knowing that her persistence had brought light to the shadows, ensuring that Katie and Evan's story would not fade into obscurity. As she walked through the newly dedicated memorial garden one crisp autumn afternoon, Caroline paused before a plaque bearing the siblings' names. Beneath it was a simple inscription, "Never forgotten." Touching her fingers to the cold metal, she whispered softly, "You're home now." And for the first time in 30 years, Maple Hollow finally felt whole again. Not perfect, but healing. The scars remained, but so too did hope, a testament to the quiet heroism of those who refused to let the truth stay buried. The burial of Katie and Evan Reynolds was a moment long denied to Margaret and James, yet one they approached with a profound mix of sorrow and gratitude. Though frail and burdened by decades of unanswered questions, they found solace in finally laying their children to rest. For the first time since that fateful summer of 1995, the Reynolds family felt something resembling peace, a fragile but meaningful closure brought about by Caroline's relentless pursuit of the truth. On a cool autumn morning, under a sky streaked with soft hues of orange and gold, Maple Hollow gathered at the cemetery to honor Katie and Evan. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had followed the story over the years came together, united by shared grief and reverence. Margaret, leaning heavily on James's arm, wore a black dress adorned with a brooch Katie had once made for her in grade school, a small token she'd kept close all these years. James, his hands trembling slightly, held a folded American flag, the same one that had draped over Evan's tiny coffin when he was born prematurely. Their presence was a testament to resilience, love enduring through unimaginable loss. Carolyn stood nearby, her heart swelling as she watched the caskets, small and white, adorned with flowers, lowered into the ground. She had fought tirelessly to bring this day to fruition, driven by a sense of duty not just to the Reynolds family, but to the memory of two innocent children whose lives had been stolen far too soon. As the service concluded, Margaret turned to Caroline, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You gave us back our babies." James nodded solemnly, gripping Caroline's hand tightly. "We couldn't have done this without you," he added. "You've been more than we deserve." Caroline shook her head, overcome with emotion. "I only did what anyone should have done," she replied softly. "Katie and Evan deserve better. From all of us." In the weeks following the funeral, Caroline grew closer to Margaret and James, forming a bond that transcended mere gratitude. They began inviting her to Sunday dinners, where stories of Katie and Evan filled the air, not with sadness, but with warmth and laughter. Margaret showed Caroline old photo albums, recounting tales of Katie's adventurous spirit and Evan's mischievous grin. James shared memories of teaching them how to ride bikes, his eyes glistening as he described the joy of watching them zoom down the street. For Margaret and James, Caroline became a kind of surrogate daughter, a bridge connecting their shattered past to a future tinged with hope. And for Caroline, the relationship offered a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she craved. Having spent much of her life feeling like an outsider in her own hometown, she now found herself embraced by the very people she had sought to help. One evening, as they sat together in the Reynolds' cozy living room, Margaret reached out and took Caroline's hand. "You remind me so much of Katie," she said gently. "Her determination, her kindness. You would have been great friends." Caroline smiled through her tears, touched by the comparison. "That means more to me than I can say," she admitted. "And if there's anything I can do to keep their memory alive, to make sure no one forgets them, you'll never have to ask twice." Inspired by Margaret and James's gratitude, Caroline decided to stay in Maple Hollow after selling her parents' house. She joined local efforts to create programs focused on child safety, mental health awareness, and community vigilance. Her work became a tribute to Katie and Evan, ensuring that their tragic deaths would inspire positive change. Margaret and James, though still weakened by age and illness, seemed renewed by the connection they had forged with Caroline. They attended community events together, sharing their story with younger generations and urging others to speak up when something, or someone, seemed off. Their courage inspired many, proving that even in the face of unimaginable pain, it was possible to find purpose and healing. As winter settled over Maple Hollow, blanketing the town in snow, Caroline visited the memorial garden one last time before the year ended. Standing before the plaque bearing Katie and Evan's names, she reflected on how profoundly their story had shaped her own life. She thought of Margaret and James, whose quiet strength had taught her the importance of persistence and forgiveness. And she thought of Hank, whose tragedy served as a stark reminder of the need for compassion and understanding. "Rest in peace," she murmured, placing a single rose at the base of the memorial. "Your legacy will live on." Walking away, Caroline felt lighter than she had in months. Though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined her, or Maple Hollow. Instead, they served as a foundation for growth, a testament to the power of truth and the enduring bonds of love. And as she stepped into the crisp December air, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, Caroline knew one thing for certain: Katie and Evan would never be forgotten, not by her, not by their parents, and not by the community that had finally learned to heal together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Maple Hollow's quiet streets. Caroline walked slowly, her footsteps crunching softly against the pavement as she took in the sights and sounds of a neighborhood reborn. Children laughed in the distance, their voices carrying on the breeze like echoes from another time. The rhythmic whirring of bicycle wheels spun through the air, a sound that once haunted her memories but now brought a bittersweet sense of comfort. She passed new families moving about their routines, a mother calling her son in for dinner, a father helping his daughter adjust her helmet before sending her off down the cul-de-sac. These moments felt familiar yet foreign, a reminder that life continued even after tragedy reshaped its course. Maple Hollow wasn't frozen in amber anymore. It had grown, evolved, and begun to heal. As she approached the edge of the woods where it all began, Caroline paused, letting the cool evening wind brush against her face. Her mind drifted back over the months of searching, uncovering, and confronting the truths buried beneath layers of fear and silence. She thought of Katie and Evan, their laughter silenced too soon, and of Hank, whose fractured mind had stolen so much while leaving behind only questions. Most of all, she thought of Margaret and James, who had entrusted her with their pain and found some measure of peace because of it. In her mind, she narrated quietly, the words flowing like a eulogy to both the past and the present. "We thought time had buried the truth, that if we waited long enough, the answers would fade into the earth alongside the memories. But time doesn't bury anything. Not really. It just tucks things away, hiding them beneath layers of distraction and denial. Like helmets under a tarp, like secrets in an attic, like a bunker swallowed by the woods. But the truth has roots deeper than any grave. It waits patiently, enduring seasons of neglect until someone comes along willing to dig. And when they do, it rises again. Not as a ghost or a curse, but as a mirror reflecting everything we tried to forget. Everything we needed to remember. Maple Hollow will never be the same. The scars are still here, etched into the trees, the sidewalks, the hearts of those who lived through it all. But scars aren't meant to disappear. They're reminders of what was lost, of what was learned, of how far we've come since then. Katie and Evan are home now. Their spirits ride these streets every time a child pedals past, every time a parent calls out a warning or shares a smile. They're part of this place, the good and the bad, the light and the dark. And though I'll carry their story with me wherever I go, I know they belong here, in the quiet hum of bicycle wheels spinning toward tomorrow. Caroline exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past lift just enough to let her breathe freely for the first time in years. Turning away from the woods, She glanced at the houses lining the street, one by one, their windows glowing warmly as lamps flickered on against the encroaching dusk. Somewhere among them, Margaret and James were likely sharing a quiet moment, finding joy in the simple act of being together. With a final glance at the horizon, Caroline stepped forward, leaving the ghosts of the past behind without forgetting them. The road ahead stretched wide and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to walk it. And as the sound of bicycle wheels faded into the twilight, Caroline smiled softly, knowing that some echoes never truly disappear. They simply become part of the song of life itself.